This is a review of the brand new DETRAIL BERG 155. It's a super mini enduro bike.
It might be the other way around, Mini Superenduro. But what is that anyway? A contradiction? To understand that, we need to find out what Superenduro means. I might be wrong, but I guess the concept Superenduro comes from the world of motorbikes. Where Superenduro is both a race class as well as a class of bikes. But in the world of mountain bikes, the name Superenduro was frequently used about 10 years back for gravity-oriented bikes with at least 170mm of front suspension. We call them free-ride bikes nowadays. These are hard-hitting bikes with sturdy frames, made for big jumps, made for the Alps. Impressive bikes, but slow bikes when you need to pedal.
So you probably don't know that much about the brand DETRAIL, but this is a Swedish brand and they launched a few trail bikes a little over 6 months ago or so. And I did a quick test, which you can find up here in the link. But even if this is a small new bike brand, make no mistake, this is the real deal. So why do DETRAIL want to call this a super mini enduro? Well, they wanted to make a poppy, a more lightweight enduro bike. It's still 160mm up front and of course, as the name suggests, 155 in the rear. But it's a lightweight bike for being in the enduro segment. We don't have big mountains here in Sweden and this bike suits Swedish terrain a lot better than these big hitters that might feel a bit sluggish and boring in regular terrain. So let's start with the most important thing in the bike, which probably is geometry, but I would like to talk about the suspension a bit. Because this is a Lyric up front. It's a Lyric 160mm fork, and it's not any Lyric. It's a Lyric Ultimate with the new Charger 3 damper, you know, buttercups and all of that, and with all of that adjustment possibilities that you would want from a fork. And a new thing that I haven't seen on a RockShox fork yet, at least, maybe it's not very new, but for me it's new. It's this little equalizer here. It's one on each leg actually. And this fork is a 35mm stanchion fork. And I know that previous versions of the Lyric did come with a longer travel. I did ride a Specialized Enduro Expert a couple of years ago, and that bike had a 170mm Lyric, which worked really great on that bike. So DETRAIL didn't go for a ZEB, and for a good reason, because the ZEB weighs a little bit more. And as we talked about earlier, this is a super mini enduro bike, and the aim for this bike is to get it as poppy and playful as possible while retaining the enduro qualities that you need in rougher terrain. In the rear we find a Super Deluxe Ultimate, and that rear shock has got I think it's a new RCT damper. I think it even is the RC2T damper on this bike, and it's also got a lot of adjustment possibilities. As you can see, the shock is mounted upside down, sort of, and that means that it is a bit tricky to get to the rebound adjustment actually. It sits right down there, so you have to fiddle a little bit, but hopefully you won't have to adjust it on every ride. Things to notice about this bike is the rear linkage, which is where the Matic sits on this bike. And one difference between this Berg 155 and the Stig 135 is this rocker linkage, whatever it's called. This is the only part of the frame that is made out of aluminium, and this is CNC machined here in Sweden actually, and maybe it will even be manufactured here in Gothenburg where I'm filming right now. So this is a solid piece of aluminium, and this is the only part of the bike that weighs a little bit more than the norm. So it's about 200 grams more or so than a carbon fiber equivalent, but it's very sturdy. Which brings me to the next point. The rigidity of this rear suspension linkage is absolutely on top. It doesn't flex from side to side, which means that the wheel can move in its travel path as it's supposed to do. It's a Crank Brothers dropper. It's 150mm on this size medium bike. If you want the 170mm dropper, you have to go up to the size large bike. And the saddle, it's a WTB saddle, which is very comfortable. I can ride it all day without padded shorts, which is a good thing because I always forget to wear them. And the grips are also from WTB, and they are very good as well. So it's a super high spec bike. The only downside, in my mind at least, are the guide brakes. These are 4-pot brakes, so they will stop the bike, but I prefer code brakes. That's all.
There is only one version of this bike available, and in this time of crisis in the bike industry, I think that's a wise choice, even if that means that there will be no entry-level version. But you can get the bike in 3 different colors: black granite, bark grey and pine green. The aesthetics is understated and minimalistic. Geometry-wise, this bike shares the same front triangle as the little brother Stig 135. But rearwards, it's an entirely different bike with bigger and sturdier details that makes this bike a bit more capable and bike park friendly. Over the years, I've learned that numbers won't tell the whole story, but they can give an indication of the intention of this bike at least. So here are some of the more important numbers. Reach is 478mm, stack height 636, head angle 64 degrees, C-tube angle is 76.5 degrees, and finally the bike's got a 440mm chainstay. It's nothing that really stands out in my opinion here. On paper, it seems to be a well-balanced bike that would work in many situations. Pedaling the bike works well, but of course the Stig 135 and in particular the Stig 115 are faster on the flats, but the Berg 155 is not too far off. I feel that it's the sticky tires that makes the most difference in efficiency. The other bikes are fairly lightweight too, and in total there's a weight penalty for the more robust Berg 155. That's to be expected. Still, I know down-country bikes that weigh about the same, and it isn't unusual that enduro bikes weigh around 16 kilos nowadays. So it's great that DETRAIL managed to keep the weight in check. It makes the bike more fun to ride, and now we come to the most important part of this review. Because this bike is lively, it might have to do with the fact that I ride a size medium bike, which should be too small for me. But when riding standing up in a bike park, I appreciate the maneuverability and I still have the confidence to ride in chunky terrain. I feel I can place the bike where I want, and the balanced geometry numbers makes this a balanced bike overall. That's great news for an average rider like myself. Confidence boosting and fun at the same time.
Yeah, looks fine.
DETRAIL emphasizes pop as one of the traits of this bike, and I will give it a 4 out of 5 for this bike type. I could probably get the bike to pop even more if I bothered to fiddle with the rebound, which I didn't do much because of my cold fingers and the somewhat difficult position of the rebound dial. The rear end behaves maturely, and I never bottomed out once, despite the fact that these trays at the very last day of a rainy season were in the absolute worst condition I've ever seen. Unfortunately, some of my favorite trays were closed due to this, but this is a good testing ground for any bike suspension. The rear linkage is naturally progressive, which makes it possible to run this bike with a coil shock if you prefer. And even if you stick with the excellent Super Deluxe Ultimate, you probably will never need to play around with any volume reducers, which in my opinion will compromise the effectiveness of the shock. Suspension design is always a compromise in itself, but I feel that DETRAIL, together with Redburn design, has struck a good balance here, making the rear end and the bike predictable, which again is important for an average rider like me. But this is not only a bike for average riders. We will most likely see a much better rider than me competing for top positions in the Swedish Enduro Cup the coming season. For a Swede like me, it's very exciting to see a Swedish brand take its rightful place among the more established brands. One thing that's not very common anymore is the fact that the cables run through the head tube. Internal cable routing can be a hassle, but no bike owner in its right mind can be happy over the trend of running the cables through the headset, right? And I also like that there's some tubing left of the fork, which makes adjustments of the handlebar height possible. Is there anything I don't like about this bike then? Well, I've already mentioned the rebound dial, which is difficult to reach. For me and my height, I do like the size medium bike because of the nimbleness, but the 150mm dropper limits me somewhat. I'm 185 centimeters tall and I ride with the saddle a bit high up, which means that the saddle is in the way in the lowest position. I need a size large bike that can take a 170mm dropper. Size large is on the other hand probably the correct size for me. Some bikes have different storage solutions, but this bike takes a minimalistic approach when it comes to storage too. So you do need to get creative if you want to bring an inner tube and some tools on your rides. About those guide brakes then. It's funny when you test different bikes, brakes always perform randomly it seems. Other guide brakes that I've tested have performed underwhelmingly. On this bike it's almost code performance, in all honesty. I don't feel that I need to upgrade the brakes, but I think if you're racing, you would want something else. Luckily, that's not the end of the world, since brake components are relatively affordable. These are rather minor details in the complete picture. This is a well-designed bike with a rather attractive price too, considering the component level. And it's great that DETRAIL have focused on the suspension performance before anything else. So, if you're in the market for a performance-oriented and fun enduro bike, I think you should put the DETRAIL by 155 on your shortlist.